The autonomic nervous system is that part of the peripheral nervous system that takes care of automatic control of the body. The central nervous system is the integrating center. The peripheral nervous system was everything outside the central nervous system. We had the sensory division that brought in input, and then we had the motor division for output. The motor division has the somatic system and the autonomic system. It's the autonomic system we're going to explore now. As we look at the difference between the somatic and the autonomic nervous system, we see that they both have sensory and motor fibers. The sensory input is pretty much the same for both systems. Somatic sensory fibers come from exteroceptors and go to the conscious part of our brain. Autonomic sensory fibers come from the visceroceptors, the internal organs, and for the most part go to the unconscious parts of our brain. The difference in the two systems come in the motor pathways. There are three ways the motor pathways vary: the effectors they go to, the way the pathway and the ganglia are laid out, and the target organ responses to the neurotransmitters released. In the somatic nervous system, the effectors are the skeletal muscles. In the autonomic nervous system, the effectors are the cardiac muscle, smooth muscles, and glands. The efferent pathways and the ganglia of the somatic nervous system have the motor ganglia in the central nervous system. They're found in the ventral horn of the spinal cord. There is only one motor neuron that goes to the effector from the central nervous system. This is the lower motor neuron. In the autonomic nervous system, the motor ganglia are found outside the central nervous system, and there are two motor neurons that go from the central nervous system to the effector. One of them comes from the spinal cord and goes to the ganglia. This is called the preganglionic neuron. The other one goes from the ganglia to the effector. This is known as the postganglionic neuron. In the somatic nervous system, all somatic motor neurons release the neurotransmitter acetylcholine. This neurotransmitter always stimulates the postsynaptic cell. In the autonomic nervous system, the preganglionic fibers release acetylcholine. The postganglionic fibers can release either norepinephrine or acetylcholine at the effectors. The effect of these neurotransmitters can be stimulatory or inhibitory. It depends upon the type of receptor on the effector. In the somatic nervous system, we have the one neuron that leaves the spinal cord and goes to the effector. It releases acetylcholine, which is always stimulatory. In the autonomic nervous system, we have two motor neurons. One goes to the ganglia, and then the second one, the postganglionic neuron, goes to the effector. The preganglionic neurons all release acetylcholine. The postganglionic fibers can release either norepinephrine or acetylcholine. The effects of the neurotransmitter on the effector will depend upon the receptor found on the effector. The autonomic nervous system is divided into two divisions. The sympathetic system is sometimes called the E system. It responds to exercise, emergency, excitement, and embarrassment. It's sometimes called the fight or flight system. The parasympathetic nervous system is sometimes called the D system. It's active in digestion, defecation, and diuresis. This is your basic housekeeping system. It's what you do day to day. Most organs receive input from both systems. This is known as dual innervation. The two systems help maintain homeostasis by sort of balancing each other out. Both systems are constantly active, but their activity levels can vary. The sympathetic system can override the parasympathetic system during emergency situations. The sympathetic and the parasympathetic systems differ three ways: the origin of the nerves, the lengths of the preganglionic and postganglionic neurons, and the location of the ganglia. In the parasympathetic system, the nerves come from the cranial and sacral regions of the spinal cord. In the sympathetic system, they come from the thoracic and lumbar regions of the spinal cord. In the parasympathetic system, the preganglionic fibers are long and the postganglionic fibers are short. But in the sympathetic system, we have short preganglionic fibers and long postganglionic fibers. That's because in the parasympathetic system, the ganglia are much closer to the effector, so we need a long preganglionic neuron to get there. In the sympathetic system, the ganglia are much closer to the spinal cord, so we only need a short preganglionic fiber to get to those ganglia. The parasympathetic system comes out of the cranial and the sacral region of the spinal cord. You will see that the preganglionic fibers are long because the ganglia are very close to the effectors. In the sympathetic system, the ganglia are close to the spinal cord. The preganglionic fibers come out of the thoracic and lumbar region and are relatively short because the postganglionic fibers go to the effectors. They're much longer. The parasympathetic system is sometimes called the craniosacral division. The cranial nerves involved in the parasympathetic system are the oculomotor, the facial, the glossopharyngeal, and the vagus. The sacral nerves involved are S2 to S4. These nerves form what are called the pelvic splanchnic nerves. These innervate the lower half of the large intestine, the urinary bladder, the ureters, and the reproductive organs. The oculomotor, the facial, and the hypoglossal all stay in the head region. The vagus nerve is the one that leaves the head and neck region and goes to organs in the thoracic and abdominal cavities. And then the sacral nerves go only to those organs that are in the pelvic region. Notice that the ganglia are very close to the effectors. The preganglionic fibers are relatively long, and the postganglionic fibers are relatively short. The sympathetic system is known as the thoracolumbar division. The preganglionic neurons come off the spinal cord in segments T1 through L2. These are the nerves that form the lateral horns of the spinal cord. They leave via the ventral root because they are motor neurons. The preganglionic fibers will leave the ventral root and pass through the white rami communicantes, which is short. Here it will enter the sympathetic trunk or the sympathetic chain ganglia, also known as the paravertebral ganglia. The paravertebral ganglia are found on either side of the spinal cord. They form what's known as the sympathetic chain ganglia. This is a chain of 23 ganglia that extend from neck to pelvis and are connected to each other. There are a few ganglia known as collateral or prevertebral ganglia. These are anterior to the spinal cord. As the spinal nerves come off of the spinal cord, the ventral root will be carrying motor neurons. The somatic motor neurons will continue on, but the autonomic motor neurons will come off at the white rami communicantes to go to one of the ganglia nearest the spinal nerve. There are three possible preganglionic pathways. The preganglionic fiber can synapse with the postganglionic fiber in the same ganglia. It can either travel up or down the chain and synapse with a postganglionic fiber in a different paravertebral ganglia, or it may pass through the paravertebral ganglia to synapse with a postganglionic fiber in a collateral ganglia. The autonomic fibers come off on the white rami communicantes, and these enter these ganglia. One pathway is for the preganglionic fiber to synapse directly with a postganglionic fiber that goes to an effector. The preganglionic fiber may go up or down the chain and come out and synapse with a postganglionic fiber at a different level. Some of the fibers will pass through the paravertebral ganglia, emerge, and synapse with a postganglionic fiber in one of the collateral ganglia, those in front of the spinal cord. Those fibers that synapse in the paravertebral ganglia will return back to the spinal curve on the gray rami communicantes. This occurs whether they synapse in the same ganglia or travel up and down the cord to synapse in a different ganglia. They will then travel with somatic fibers to the effectors. As the spinal nerve gets to the general area it will innervate, it will branch to the somatic effectors in the area and to the autonomic effectors in the same location. One pathway is for the preganglionic neuron to come out, go into the nearest ganglia, synapse with the postganglionic fiber, return on the gray rami communicantes to the spinal nerve, and travel to its effector. A second pathway is for it to come out, go into a ganglia but travel up or down the chain before it synapses with its postganglionic fiber. At this level, it will use the gray rami in order to get back to this spinal nerve and travel to its effectors. The third pathway is for the preganglionic fiber to pass through the paravertebral ganglia to go to a collateral ganglia. These nerves will form several splanchnic nerves, the thoracic, the lumbar, and the sacral. The splanchnic nerves interweave and form the aortic complex. This serves the entire abdominopelvic cavity. There are four major collateral ganglia, the celiac, the hypogastric, the superior mesenteric, and the inferior mesenteric. The third pathway has the preganglionic fiber coming out on the spinal nerve, using the white rami communicantes to get to the paravertebral ganglia, but not synapsing, passing on through, becoming part of a splanchnic nerve, and going to a prevertebral or collateral ganglia. Here it will synapse with its postganglionic fiber, and the postganglionic fiber will go to whatever organ it innervates. The adrenal medulla is stimulated by the sympathetic system, and it has a very special way that this happens. Some of the preganglionic fibers pass directly to the adrenal medulla. They do not synapse in a paravertebral ganglia or a prevertebral ganglia. When these nerves are stimulated, the medullary cells are stimulated to secrete norepinephrine and epinephrine into the bloodstream. Since the sympathetic nerve fibers release norepinephrine as a neurotransmitter, we perpetuate the sympathetic response. The neurotransmitter response is quick and very short-lived, but the epinephrine and norepinephrine from the adrenal medulla will stimulate the same receptors as the neurotransmitter. This will keep the sympathetic response going for a longer period of time. Here's an example of how this works. You are pulling off campus and a car comes out of nowhere and almost hits you. Your sympathetic nervous system quickly fires. This lets you immediately hit your brakes. Norepinephrine is released. But that's it. The sympathetic system is done. However, it also stimulated the adrenal medulla. Norepinephrine and epinephrine was immediately released into your bloodstream. This means your endocrine system has been activated. The epinephrine and the norepinephrine in your bloodstream continue to act on those same effectors, and their effects last much longer, approximately 15 minutes. Gastric motility slows down. This is why you may feel sort of sick to your stomach or sort of have a lump in your stomach. Your heart rate, your blood pressure goes up, your breathing rate increases, and you may break out into a sweat. You may get the shakes, but all of this is because of the secondary epinephrine and norepinephrine that was released as a result of the adrenal medulla being stimulated. And of course, the adrenal medulla was stimulated as part of your sympathetic response. We mentioned visceral reflex arcs when we talked about reflex arcs in general. They have the same components as a somatic reflex arc, but the visceral reflex arc has two motor neurons. Pain traveling on visceral sensory fibers will travel along the same pathways as somatic pain fibers. Sometimes the stimulation of the visceral fibers is enough to stimulate the somatic fibers as well. The somatic fibers go to your conscious brain, and your conscious brain is wired that that fiber comes from a particular location. The pain really may be coming from your gallbladder, but your right shoulder thinks it hurts. This is what referred pain is. Here we see a visceral reflex arc. There's a stimulus that will trigger a receptor in the viscera, and a visceral sensory neuron will carry this to the central nervous system. So far, this is just like a regular reflex arc. There's an integration center in the central nervous system, and this will stimulate the motor neuron. This is where we differ between a somatic and a visceral reflex arc. There are two motor neurons that will go to the visceral effector and yield the response.